Hello, you're listening to Liberty Rants. It's never been more evident than today that many people of the United States, and the world for that matter, look at the government like some sort of mother-type figure. They seem to think that the government can solve all the world's problems, and of course each of their individual problems as well. We've all heard people say, there ought to be a law, whenever they see something that they do not like. But what these people seem to miss is that not only is the government the worst institution to solve most problems, it's also not their role in a truly free and prosperous society. You see, when you give the government the authority to begin a program or attempt to solve a problem, you're also giving them the authority over a portion of your life, and thus a piece of your freedom. Having said this, there is a proper role of government in a free society. But before we discuss what that role is, let me first lay out what the role of the government was designed to be in the United States. Then we'll compare its designated role to its current state. As most of you should already know, the United States was originally made up of 13 colonies along the east coast of what is now the United States. These 13 colonies were originally under British rule, thus they had to abide by the laws of a faraway king. Of course, the British king imposed numerous egregious taxes and laws upon the colonists. Most of these taxes would seem like a picnic compared to how our government abuses us citizens today. But these laws and taxes drove the colonists, or patriots, to reject British rule. A series of rebellious acts by the patriots led to the drafting and later the adoption of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, thereby creating the United States. The Declaration is one of the greatest documents ever written, in my opinion, thank you to Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the majority of it. The reason being is that it's the first establishing document establishing a country that declares the people have natural rights. That means that the rights are granted by God or nature, not by the government. This document lays the groundwork for a very unique country that is founded on the principles of individual liberty, private property rights, and self-governance. Let me demonstrate by reading the most popular and moving passage from the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. These ideas for natural rights stem from philosophers such as John Locke, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas. This idea was completely opposite to the majority of governments throughout history, as well as today. Most governments are ruled through power, where it is assumed that the rights of the people are only decided upon by those in power. Nobody else has tried this experiment of self-governance. We even have a special term for this. It's American exceptionalism. Now, some academics and leftists today construe the true meaning of this phrase. They say it means Americans are arrogant. But the true meaning of the phrase is that Americans see themselves as different or unique among other countries. Specifically, that they value natural law, individual rights, and limited government. It's important to note that the United States didn't have the same constitution as they do now during its founding, the Revolutionary War, or for several years after. The United States was originally united under a constitution entitled the Articles of Confederation, beginning in 1777. The Articles of Confederation did provide some unification of the states through a Congress, but largely allowed each state to govern themselves individually. Of course, some felt that there were some troubles with this in regards to trade and the military. Thus, a 3-month debate from May to September of 1787, entitled the Constitutional Convention, was had between the Federalists, who wanted a more centralized government and a new constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who wanted to keep things as they were under the Articles of Confederation. Long story short, what came out of this long, arduous debate was the Constitution of the United States. It was originally ratified in 1788. The Constitution was created by the states and lists specific enumerated powers granted to the federal government. This means that the federal government can only do those specified items stated within the Constitution itself. Nothing outside of those powers or acts stated within the Constitution can be implemented or be under the control of the federal government. The Constitution is based in federalism, which means that the powers of the government are separated between the national government and the states. Under the Constitution, power is also separated into 3 separate branches: the judicial, the executive, and the legislative. Each branch having equal power and providing checks and balances over the other 2. The Constitution also contains a Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments and carries the original sentiments of the Declaration of Independence. The first 9 amendments spell out those individual or natural rights that the government may never violate, such as the freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the right to a fair trial, and many others. The 10th Amendment states the powers not delegated to the federal government are retained by the states or the people. Of course, there are provisions to alter this Constitution, and that's why we have 27 amendments today. But this general understanding of the Constitution, which is known as a Madisonian democracy, is what we ended up with, and the understanding of the Constitution's purpose remained that way for over 100 years. Again, the most important element being that the Constitution was written to grant specific enumerated powers to the federal or national government, and that the federal government could not step outside these powers or violate any of the Bill of Rights. But then everything changed during what is called the Progressive Era, beginning with the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, and even more so under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt began by drastically manipulating the intention of the Constitution and despised the idea of individual rights. Instead of seeing the Constitution as intended, which is a detailed explanation of enumerated powers, or those powers granted to the federal government by the states, Roosevelt believed that the federal government and the presidents may do anything as long as it is not expressly prohibited to it within the Constitution. In other words, Roosevelt believed that as president, he could do anything as long as the Constitution did not forbid it. Roosevelt used this clever manipulation on the intention of the Constitution to greatly expand the powers of the executive branch and the presidency to do whatever he wanted. Just to provide an example of the way he viewed the presidency, the most executive orders issued by any single president prior to Roosevelt was 217. Roosevelt issued 1,081 executive orders. Woodrow Wilson then continued the abuse on the Constitution and on individual rights. He ushered in so-called progressive policies such as the federal income tax, the Federal Trade Commission, and began the U.S. dependency on a private bank called the Federal Reserve. In addition, he started the war on drugs under the Harrison Act. He entered World War I and began foreign interventionist policies that continue today. He also banned speech against the war and even imprisoned individuals for speaking out against it. Most damning, he presented the idea that the Constitution was a living document, a ridiculous notion that the meaning of the words in the Constitution change over time with changes in attitude of society. This is now taught in law universities throughout the country and is dead wrong. This view of the Constitution has allowed for the great expansion of the federal government to rule over every part of our lives, as well as to take money and redistribute it to others upon the government's own discretion. To make matters even worse, not only did progressive presidents trample the Constitution and the individual rights of the general population, they were also abhorrent racists. Wilson in particular made sure his offices were filled with racist segregationists. He praised the Ku Klux Klan and he opposed Reconstruction. After these 2 horrendous presidents redefined the purpose of the Constitution and usurped the power to expand the executive branch and the presidency, the federal government continued to grow under every president thereafter. Almost every single president, both Democrat and Republican, continued to abuse the Constitution and the presidency in the same manner as these 2 presidents. We now have presidents that make laws, create branches of government and programs that steal from some citizens and give to others. We have broad one-size-fits-all policies across the entire country, regardless of their particular state's situation. People and businesses continue to lose their rights. We have more people in jail for nonviolent crime and victimless crimes than ever. The government continues to discriminate against people and businesses. Some people and businesses get subsidies, while others get nothing. And us taxpayers funding this bloated government have little to say in any of these actions. This, I can assure you, is not the proper role of government. The government is an artificial entity created by human beings. Therefore, we can take our natural rights back. We do not exist to serve the government. The government exists to serve our purposes. But that doesn't mean violating the individual rights of one person to provide to another. So you may be asking, what is the proper role of government then? First off, it's obvious that natural law and individual rights are the foundation of any free society. Government was created by the people, as I've said before. The government didn't create people or their rights. Simply stated, I believe the smaller and more localized the government, the better off we are to live free and prosperous lives. It's also obvious that free markets and market competition is the best way to increase prosperity and better livelihoods of everyone. There are also many models of government, but it seems that Thomas Jefferson was right when he stated, the natural progress of things is for the government to gain ground and liberty to yield. This has certainly been true in history. For this reason, I believe the use of government should be avoided at all costs, and if necessary, should be very localized. Therefore, I believe the government is only necessary for the following things: to protect individual rights or property rights, to adjudicate disputes, to provide a legal framework in which voluntary trade is protected, and to provide for a national defense. Having said all this, since we're Americans, we must work within the framework the founders set up for us to make any progress towards the goal of returning freedom to our society. Fortunately, they believed in limited government, and they had the great idea that the people and states should be sovereign entities, free to govern themselves. Therefore, we must reel back the federal usurpation of power and return it back to the states and individuals. Because a government close to its people serves the desires of its people better. I would take this even further. Local governments such as counties and municipalities would be even better at serving their constituents. Therefore, we the people need to fight even state control and allow for our local governments to serve those purposes that we choose. Think about the possibilities if we lived in that type of society. If you see one county or municipality not properly governing or imposing their will on the citizens, then you could just move to another. This localized government allows for choice, which is always the best option. So how do we do this, you may be asking? Well, I believe the best way to return power back to the states and local governments is through nullification. Nullification was a concept used by colonists to refuse British rule, and it was officially labeled by Thomas Jefferson in 1798. Nullification is the idea that the states and even local governments can and must refuse to enforce unconstitutional laws or acts, specifically those imposed on us by the federal government. This can also be done at the state level. Governors, the Supreme Court, law enforcement, and even individuals should disobey unconstitutional laws. Although I recommend that the resistance to many of these laws is better done by a governing body, such as a state or county, or large groups of people, as it's much less likely that they'll face punishment by these tyrants. Right now you may be thinking that I'm crazy, but this was the course of action recommended by James Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution. In 1798 he wrote, "In case of deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers, not granted by said contract, the states who are parties thereto have the right and are duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them." In addition, nullification has been used many times. In fact, I'm proud to say that Wisconsin used it to reject the fugitive slave laws. I'm also proud to say that a form of this is being used right now in regards to COVID mandates by the law enforcement officers in my own home county. Also, dozens of states nullified the Real ID Act of 2005. We need more of this resistance in our current political climate. Our governments, especially the federal government, has complete control over our lives. The federal government has twisted the purpose of the Constitution and abused clauses and phrases in the Constitution, such as the General Welfare Clause, to expand the government to do whatever they want. In fact, most federal programs are technically unconstitutional because of these abuses. It's time to take a stand and use nullification. I understand that right now it seems that political tension is at its highest point in many of our lives. Even families are divided on politics. I wish I could say that we should just let our political disagreements go and that we shouldn't lose, friends over politics, but I'm afraid I don't agree completely with that sentiment. I think we should debate and defend the idea of limited government at all nonviolent costs. That means if you lose friends or family members as a result, it's their loss. Because it's them who are advocating for your natural rights to be abused. Think about it. Why is it that most conservative-leaning or especially libertarian-minded folks are never asking the left or the right for anything but to live free from oppressive rules and to express their natural God-given rights? These rights don't require anything of the left. They don't require higher taxes. They don't require special programs or forgiveness of debt. They only require that we be left alone. And leftists demand that you provide for their falsely labeled rights at the expense of something of yourself, whether it be increased taxes, less choices, or missed opportunities. If those on the left want programs, even on the right for that matter, they should be fighting for them at the local level. But what I'm saying is likely controversial to many on the left, for sure, because they don't want us to have choice over their programs, regulations, or taxes. They want us to be forced to comply with their demands through a large one-size-fits-all federal government. For this reason, we must resist and disobey unjust and unconstitutional laws. We must demand political candidates that will not abuse the Constitution. We must write our own local and state representatives and demand that they reject unconstitutional laws and those that violate natural rights. We can bring back the ideas of freedom together, and unfortunately, we are the only ones that can save our natural rights. Please like, share, and subscribe to help spread this message of liberty.